Well, hey friends, thanks for being with us. Welcome to week 3 of our series called Hindsight, as we've been looking at lessons from 2020 that we learned in special ways then that really are going to help shape and inform us for the future that God has for us. And this week, we're learning something that I think is going to be really challenging. So I just want to thank you again for being here, for leaning into the content today as we talk about the powers that be and the lessons that we learned from 2020 about power. So without further ado, let's jump in and see what we've got. On April 5th, 1968, the day after Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, there was a teacher who had a classroom of third graders in her small Iowa town of Riceville, Iowa, and she nearly 700 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee. And she decided that she was going to do a really special and interesting experiment, one that I hope, honestly, I imagine maybe you know what I'm talking about, and I really hope you've seen it. If you haven't, you gotta look this thing up. It's wild to watch this. But basically, she takes this classroom of third graders and she looks at them that next day after he had been murdered and says, you know what? Brown-eyed kids, this room of all white kids, but she looks at them and goes, brown-eyed kids are just plain smarter, more civilized, and just better than blue-eyed kids. Now we all know, obviously, clearly this isn't true because hazel eyes are the best. But anyway, in this moment, in this classroom, she goes ahead and gives the brown-eyed kids special privileges. She says, you get special treatment. You're allowed to do certain things. And they are given what the blue eyes didn't have. But what they're really given in this moment is the very thing that turns kids, turns teenagers, turns men and women, grown men and women alike, into these various versions of Smeagol drooling after the ring. And it's that one thing we all love to have, power. But then, in a turn of events, Jane Elliott apologetically the next day approaches her class and says, you know what, actually, I got it wrong. I hate to say it, but... And kids trusting their teacher, as kids are prone to do at that age, and especially, maybe particularly in that place and time many years ago, they had to come to grips with the reality that the opposite was true. She told them, you know what, in fact, it's actually that blue-eyed kids are smarter, are more civilized, and are better. And if you have seen this video, you know the kids' reactions are so amazing, profound, interesting. You gotta watch it. But as I saw this famous experiment kind of re-emerge into the conversations of people last year, it was around the time and around the circumstances of George Floyd's murder. And people were just wrestling. We were trying to understand and explain why extreme bias can exist, why it can go unchecked, why the mistreatment of others would seem so normalized at times. And as big as racism is, and as much as we saw that there in that moment, I think an even bigger issue was actually at play. I think it's an issue that was at play in the experiment in 1968. It was at play in George Floyd, his murder, but even other places in 2020. I mean, we saw it in the election. We saw it in the insatiable thirst for toppling the powers that were to make the powers that would be. And we've seen it even in the tumultuous, destructive, and divisive aftermath of that toppling of those powers to get new powers. But this, what I'm talking about today, it dates back to our ancestors. Not just some of our ancestors, like all of our ancestors. I'm talking about the ancestors, the very first residents of this globe that you and I live on. The ones who were living naked and carefree in a garden just for themselves where they could walk and talk with the creator of it all. They were in paradise, but the very thing that took paradise and tore it out of their hands, it still threatens to tear it from anyone else's today. And it's this, a thirst for power. See, the serpent's empty offer of, you know what, you can be like God. It looked too good to be true, and in fact, it was too good to be true. And yet, Even less than 10 chapters later, in a Bible with 1,189 of them, we hear a recorded tale of humanity's exploits to go ahead and build a great tower to make a name for themselves. Towers, monuments, clamoring for power, pushing to be in control, to be great, to be responsible for making things great. This was the way of our ancestors. And it's the way of our ancestors and the way of us because it is the way of the wicked human heart that we have. It shows up in government as much as it shows up in small schoolrooms in Iowa. It shows up in ancient empires as much as it shows up in your marriage or in dealing with your parents. We love power. We love the control of ordering our lives, of being in control of our lives and the destiny of them and, forging our own destinies. And honestly, a little bit, we like to control others too and forge their destinies and their futures. Let's be honest, we love getting our way. And while that may show up in different ways, it still shows up a lot. Even Jesus saw it show up. Now, not in himself, because he was and is the only human ever in all history to live without a sinful nature, and so to live being perfect. Now, it doesn't mean he wasn't tempted. In fact, the Dr. Luke, in his gospel account of Jesus' life, in the 4th chapter, he records a moment where Jesus was tempted by Satan himself. And while each of Satan's 3-pronged attempt was different in a little bit of different ways, each of the 3 points to one thing where he's basically arguing and trying to tempt Jesus with this: grasp power. And it's interesting to think of it that way. That's what he was going for with each of his different temptations, was simply grasp and hold on to power. So when I say that Jesus saw it show up, it wasn't that he gave into the temptation of power. I'm talking about him seeing it as up close and personal as you can get. He saw it in those of his friends that were his closest friends. Can you imagine for a moment, just imagine this now, the irony of being the literal Son of God, perfect in every way, from God and soon to return to God, and you have men that you created in your own image that are within earshot of you, arguing over which of them is the greatest. Because that's what was the most common argument we find in Scripture, they tell us, was the most common argument of the disciples, was them bickering and going, who's the greatest among them? Now, personally, I've heard that argument in my marriage before, because I've had that argument in my marriage before. No, not directly, because I'm not that much of an idiot, okay? But, indirectly, in arguing vehemently to prove my point, arguing to get my way. I've had that argument not just in my marriage, but I've had it at workplaces. Moments where I looked at the boss and I'm going, the boss has no idea what they're doing. They absolutely have no clue what they're doing. I could do this better. I should be given some of the decision-making power. Because power is tempting, isn't it? In various ways, in schoolyard scuffles, in dating relationships, in office politics, and I suppose maybe even in governmental politics too, maybe. But I want us to realize a truth of all history, but one that was shown to us in real special ways in 2020. Not only is power tempting, but in 2020 we really got to see that power is fleeting too. One moment you're a bright brown-eyed, brilliant 3rd grader who's better than those blue eyes. And then the next minute, Miss Elliott is telling you that you're incompetent and you're getting less recess time. 1 minute you're a governor who's obscure and not everyone knows you or listens to you or cares about you, and the next minute we are all watching every week as you have an address to us, and we're all listening to hear what you're going to say. We know your name. Presidents come and presidents go. People in places of power at all different levels, they will gain power and some will lose power, and then some who lost power will gain power and some who gained power will lose power. This is the nature of how it works. And in our natural temptation, when we start to realize, oh my gosh, yeah, that's right, power is fleeting. People are vying for my power, or I might not have power in this situation or that one. When we begin to see how fleeting power is, we have a natural temptation to fight with even greater fervor, to hold on, or to try and gain more power. And I'm curious, have you ever seen this in people in your life? Like, have you noticed that this is something that people do? You've experienced it maybe firsthand, or let's be really honest, have you ever noticed how you do this? Have you ever picked up on the ways that you tend to get more aggressive in moments when you feel like you're not being appreciated, when you're not getting the power that you want? Have you noticed how you sometimes will, in your work or in your church or in your school or in your relationships with family or whatever it might be, how you want to have power? Well, I want to offer to us a new option today, and I want to be clear with you. Power isn't necessarily bad. So I'm not trying to convince us we don't want to have anything to do with it. I'm just trying to convince us it's just not as important as we often want to make it to be. See, we want to be great. I believe all of us do. We want to be great, even if we call great something different. Whether it looks like being more respected, or even more loved, or simply even more remembered. We want to be great. But if we want to be great, we need to exchange the thirst for power for a different pursuit, a more meaningful pursuit, and a more godly pursuit. So actually, I want us to look today at a powerful moment from the life of the most powerful man to ever walk this earth. And so if you have your Bibles, I want you to join me in John's Gospel. John chapter 13 is where we're going to be at, which for those of you who are doing our 21 days of prayer and fasting, you're going to find this is pretty great how this times out. But John 13, we're going to join Jesus and his disciples in the upper room, the Last Supper, a really powerful moment, but a really interesting one when it comes to power. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered him, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who is bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, "Do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." Now, since we're promised to be blessed, which means happy, and I think we all like to be blessed and happy, if we know these things and also do them, well, then I want to spend our time today delving into these two things then. And it starts with knowing these things. The thing it starts with is right estimations. See, in the upper room that night, there were a lot of estimations going on. And I'm not talking about like financial estimates or estimations. Now, I'm talking more personal than that. The disciples, as I had already mentioned, had a penchant for arguing, and a penchant for arguing about who was greater among them. And if you know anything about relational dynamics, and I know you do, marriage or friendships or dating, you name it, any relationship kind of thing, you know that many arguments will involve words, but then it can also just as easily be an argument that involves no words, but just actions that speak a whole lot too. Actions like walking into the room for an annual festive meal together, and everyone's waiting for someone else to take care of the glaring need that was there in front of them all. You see, they would walk, all of them would walk these streets, these dirty streets with sandals, open-toed shoes. And these streets that I'm talking about here in the Middle East back in Jesus' time, they didn't have the debris of gas-powered cars, things like oil spills or hubcaps here and there. They had the debris of grass-powered livestock. You can imagine what I'm talking about. So their feet were filthy, and the food was fancy. So the question is, who would get their feet to match the nature of the meal? And they probably all estimated that the one they called rabbi, teacher, wasn't the lowest of them. So that wasn't going to be the one to do it. Of course, by the way, that was the thing they were estimating, is in that moment, who's the lowest? Like, who's the most reasonable one to serve in that moment in a humbling way, in such a humbling way, as to get down and wash their feet. So no, not no to Jesus, obviously. But maybe Andrew or maybe Thomas or Bartholomew. Yeah, Bart. Bart's the one for sure. It probably is. They were milling around that room that night, waiting for someone to serve, because they all apparently thought that they were too good for that obvious need. It makes me think of a poignant question from Gene Knight's 1970s classic funk song, "Who do you think you are, Mr. Big Stuff?" But really, like, who do you think you are, Mr. Big Stuff? Or who do you think you are, Miss Big Stuff? Like, what is the unspoken view that you have of yourself right now? What is the unspoken view that you have of yourself when it comes to people that are maybe in a different political view than you, or in your marriage, or in your family dynamics, or at work? It's critical for us to think about this and to get this right, of who we are and who we're not, of what we're meant to be in this life and what we're not called to be. See, if you look back to the Tower of Babel, which I alluded to earlier, we learn that as long as we're about building a name for ourselves, no matter how many bricks we've already layered so far, we'll always end up in the end a babbling fool. So, the 12 disciples, they seem to regularly think that they had made it big by being in Jesus' entourage. And by being able to join Jesus on this journey he was going on, they kind of started to think, man, we're a big deal. They estimated that they were worth too much. And in a grasp for keeping their sense of power, they waited with dirty feet to see who's going to go ahead and show that they aren't as powerful. But in verse 3, it says that, and this is crazy, so check it out. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God. So he knew in this moment, he was God. He was begotten of God, the Messiah, God himself. And he knew that God had put everything into his hands. So, like, what do you do with the recognition that you have that much power? Can you imagine what possibility there could be of the next sentences that John could write there? Like things like, then all of a sudden, Jesus realizing all of that sent fire down from heaven to destroy everything, or suddenly just destroyed the Romans that were occupying Israel and oppressing them, or suddenly made his 12 disciples into valiant warriors to fight for him in his battle against this, or just simply ascended to the throne of Jerusalem. And instead, the next sentence says that he actually took off his outer garment and descended to the level of the crud-encrusted feet of his friends. That's Jesus doing that, right? So now for a second here, imagine if we had the right estimation of ourselves. Now, I'm not saying here that we look at ourselves and go, I'm just a mere accident of evolution who isn't worth anything, or that I'm a miracle of divine foresight who deserves it all. Not that I'm nothing or that I'm everything, but a healthy estimation of ourselves that says, you know what? I'm somebody that God was pleased to create, and I get this opportunity to live for him. As estimations go, I love this sentiment from David from back in the Old Testament when he writes and says, "Oh Lord, make me know my end, and what is the measure of my days? Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath." Selah, which is kind of like a breath or a pause in a music. Commentators have said, when they look at this whole psalm that David wrote, that it's a song of both simultaneous hope and despair. And I think I get that. Like, don't you, when you think about it? We can despair at the fragility of life, the fragility of our power, the fragility of our control over life. But we can also, at the same time, hope in the fact that God is bigger than all of these. Like, he's big enough to grant us purpose in all of these. And he's big enough to grant us a name that can be remembered and celebrated like David's was. Remembered not even for his rise to power as much as David was known for how significantly he served. See, the brown-eyed Iowan third graders' way of seeing themselves when they were on top, and the 12 disciples' way of seeing themselves when they were able to walk and talk with the very Jesus himself, and then what they determined, both of these groups, to do because of these views of themselves were profound. So when we see ourselves as special, as kind of a little bit, better maybe, we're often tempted to want to promote ourselves above others, to create larger gaps between us and them, and to potentially even mistreat them to kind of assert our dominance, to show we're on top. And this is the workings of earthly power. Power that can be political, power that can be racial, power that can be relational. And Jesus calls us to a new and different estimations of our worth, as well as the second thing, not just new estimations, but right applications. See, Jesus recognizing that he was God in the flesh, and I love that John includes this. It's so interesting that John has to take a pause and kind of preface this moment of washing their feet by making sure we understand Jesus recognizing he was God in the flesh, and that God had given everything into his hands. That could have been the lead in line to a whole bunch of wild and crazy things, like I said earlier. Things where Jesus gets revenge on his enemies, where he forces all to worship him, or where he enjoys absolute restful bliss and kicks back and just enjoys it. Now, what's interesting is that Scripture tells us that there is a day where God will have his revenge against the enemy forces, where every knee will bow before Jesus, where he has an eternal home of rest and bliss where he can enjoy it. But in the moment here in John 13, the mission is specific still. And in fact, John is pointing out, Jesus was clear the estimation was going to lead to an application of, I'm here to love God and love my neighbor by serving them selflessly. So what's interesting is that this humble and yet full of power approach that Jesus is taking in this moment actually did more to be memorable than him clamoring for power that he could have. And that's because he was choosing in this moment significance over power. He was choosing the right application of his influence. Now, I've been reflecting on this and how this shows up personally in my life in certain ways. So lately, Madeline and I have been thinking and talking about some of the conflicts we have, and more really talking about how we have those conflicts. And I'm realizing a lesson that I've learned before, but still kind of needed to learn again, which, by the way, for those of you who are single and eventually looking to get married, that is what marriage really ends up being. It's just learning lessons that you've already learned, but you keep on needing to learn them over and over again, and hopefully learning them better and more. But the lesson I'm learning is this, is that winning doesn't always lead to being a winner. And it's a tough lesson for me to learn, if I'm being honest. But sometimes choosing to lose is actually the greatest way for you to win. See, it's actually about losing at the right things and winning at the right things. Howard Hendricks once said this poignant quote, "My greatest fear," he said, "is not that I might fail, but that I might succeed at doing something that isn't truly significant." See, significance, my friend, is greater than power. And we sometimes lose sight of that. Sometimes you can have both, quite frankly, but many times you'll have to give up one in order for you to have the other. And so sometimes we've decided to give up significance because we wanted to have power. We wanted to have control. And I'm asking you to really realize what God is saying in John 13. Jesus, with all of the estimation that he has, he chose the better one. Now, the wisdom of our world says that the demonstration of your greatness is your power, is your influence, is your pull over a situation, is your swing, being able to swing things. Power and influence, pull at work, swing in governance, or being able to control your parents or your children or your spouse or your friend group, your whatever you want to put in that next blank, you name it, being able to have power, influence, control, swing, and whatever it is over that. But Jesus shows us instead actually another way. And this is the one thing that I hope that you get from today. And it's, I think, fairly going to be impacting us if we get this. The demonstration of your greatness is the level of your service. The demonstration of your greatness is the level of your service. It's counterintuitive. That's why I need to say it twice, because I need to make sure we get it. But Jesus really did rise to a special greatness in descending to wash their feet. You know, I think we notice this when we find people that we have looked at as most significant in our life. The people that have impacted our lives are not usually the people that clamored for power or fought to be in control. It's the people that served us in profound ways. As teacher, Jesus was communicating, honestly, he was communicating a lesson that day that was greater than mere words. And as he told his disciples that day when he did use words, he also meant for us to hear and obey it in these verses when he says, "For I have given you an example that you also should do, just as I have done to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you actually do them." So maybe you knew this was all true to a certain extent, and maybe you knew it well before 2020 came along. But as we look back, and as we look in hindsight to last year, and then as we look forward to the years ahead, I want to ask the question, what are we going to fight for? What are you going to choose to fight for? Will we pursue power, or will we seek significance? Are you going to keep fighting for control of your life, control over others? Or are you going to see serving God and serving others as actually your greatest opportunity? It really, and believing that, not just saying it, but actually believing that serving God and serving others is the greatest opportunity for you to be great. That you will realize that your greatness, the demonstration of your greatness is the level of your service. If you saw serving God first and foremost as your life's greatest good, and you saw serving others in grace and truth as its natural outpouring, a couple questions. How much then would you need to lean on God to do that? Like, how much would you realize, man, I'm gonna need to lean heavily on God and his power in order to live in that direction, in that life? Also, who would you need to apologize to, or at the very least, change how you treat? Are you thinking of people? Our names or our faces coming to mind? And lastly, what would you need to maybe put your hands to doing in order to start serving like that? As you look at your life, with however many years you have, a handbreadth that it is, don't you want your life to be great? Whatever greatness means for you, don't you want your life to mean what Christ means for it to mean? If you want to do that, then maybe you and I need to start learning, I'm going to give up power. I'm going to sink down. I'm going to take the towel and I'm going to wash some feet, proverbially, whatever that means. And I want to go ahead and I'm going to get the level of my service to demonstrate how great I can be. I'm going to serve others. I'm going to serve God. That's how you truly become great. Hey guys, as we kind of look at the things that we have ahead, I just want to make a clear connection between how the messages we hear connect to what we do. We want to make sure it's always that way. So as we talk about forward shift trainings and giving to the new building and that project and just other things, it really is for us an opportunity to equip you to live fully alive in Christ by giving you opportunities to help serve, to help use the gifts that you have, to help use your time, your talent, and your treasure for something greater than just yourself, for something that really is something that Jesus says he loves, his church, and loving the lost and the people that are searching and in need of the good news of Jesus. So everything we're doing right now, especially in a time like this, is really concentrated. It's really focused on that. So we'd love for you to join us today at 2 o'clock if you're able to for the Forward Shift training at Riverside Church. It'll be an hour and a half and it's going to be great as we dive into week 2 of that. And then also, if you want to give to continue to support the mission of Alive Church, feel free to go online or to mail in your gift. You can mail it in via check, or you can go ahead and do it digitally through text or through online. But thank you so much for being a part of Alive Church during this season. We're excited about 2021 and all it's going to bring, and I'm praying that this would be the most powerful year for you, not because you clung to power, but because you chose significance instead.